All right. Well, hello, dear listener, and welcome to our next episode of the Freedom Speak podcast, the mouthpiece for Freedom Speak International, an organization built for and by the immigrant community in Canada to articulate and amplify issues that matter to them. In this podcast, we support, encourage, and promote free speech within the confines of the rule of law, respect for oneself, respect for others, and individual responsibility. We are joined in the studio by Mr. Samuel Kisitu, an immigrant and strong advocate for adequate, decent, and affordable housing for immigrants and vulnerable people experiencing homelessness in Canada. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Kisitu. Mr. Kisitu, like many people in Canada, has experienced homelessness, but unlike most, he is doing something about it. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Kisitu. Please start by introducing yourself.
Yes, thank you, Wanja. I am so happy to be hosted here on the Freedom Speak podcast. In fact, I am happy that today I am hosted on this platform to amplify voices, not only for myself, but for so many people like me. My name is Samuel Kisitu, aka Freeman. I am known as Freeman not because I'm free, but because once all of us are free, I will be a free man. So I am I am a Ugandan-born political refugee, a filmmaker, and a community advocate. I am based here in Toronto. I came in Canada in 2019. Being it's now 40 years of dictatorship of President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. After witnessing generations of political repression that began in my homeland in Ruwero, my father had supported Museveni as civilian veterans when he staged war against the incumbent or the government of Milton Obote. When he staged the war, when he mentioned that, he informed the world that his election had been rigged in the 1980 election, he made to fulfill his goals of taking power. He staged war in my homeland, a war that consumed 500,000 people, displaced millions of lives of people, and destroyed their property. That war took my own brother to my dad or my father, Tata Rubuama Livingstone. That is the trauma that I grew up with, and get away from. That is the trauma which I took away from the 1986 war. In fact, I must tell the world that if the war had taken my own father, I wouldn't be born in 1989, 3 years after the war.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that
Thank you so much
very
for that.
elaborate background story. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about your arrival in Canada and your experiences with homelessness. Perhaps I'm thinking that perhaps that's the impetus for which you are now an activist for housing.
Yes. Coming in Canada, I fled away with like many people, with my shirt, my pair of trousers. Of course, my passport, which entered me here in Canada, in Toronto. From Montreal, I arrived in Toronto. I arrived with the Narubare Medal of Honor given to me, of course, by President Museveni when I met him in 2015. It was a symbol of liberation, but in my hands, a symbol of liberation later became a symbol of betrayal. This gave me a new assignment to start again without looking back, to start again. But Canada giving me safety when I arrived in 2019 September. Canada, I appreciate Canada for giving me safety. Because when I arrived and gave myself a name Freeman, I felt that this time I am safe. But along the journey, safety without housing is just survival. Before I found stable housing in December of 2023. I was one of over 15,000 people experiencing homelessness in Toronto, according to the city's 2024 street needs assessment. I slept in church, in Dominion Church International Toronto, storage rooms and shelters like Fred Victor, Seton House, Cornerstone Men's Shelter, and I was caring for others as a frontline worker during COVID-19. I didn't have a home myself doing all this. Much appreciation to Pastor Eddie Jumba, a story around how my homelessness starts. Of course, when I arrived here, I went to Cornerstone Men's Shelter. 2 months later, with the help of OW, my housing worker, who assigned me to find a house costing 600. It wasn't easy to find it. And instead, I found a room costing, was it 850? But unfortunately, I didn't have a top up. But I was convinced that I'll get a job and work, which I didn't realize that it's not easy to just find a job when you just arrived in Canada. From Uganda, I'm a teacher of fine art. So coming here, I didn't have a chance for my papers to be recognized. And without documents, I had to really find temporary work, which was also not easy, which informed me that I will be evicted if I don't pay my rent in time and promptly and adequately. I had to leave. That is when I went to Pastor Jumba to ask for storage room, and started living in the storage room at the Dominion Church International, Toronto, in January of
Thank you for
2020.
that very, very emotive story. Yeah, Mr. Kisito, as you're aware, and I am aware that Canada is facing an unprecedented housing crisis, and statistics are indicating that the country will need to build thousands of houses, tens of thousands of houses every year to house the unhoused, many of whom are immigrants and asylum seekers and people living in exile. So, but unlike many people who have experienced homelessness, you have done something different. I want to hear more about why it is that you decided that over and above your own struggle with housing and maybe affordable housing and work, you would become an activist for adequate, decent, and affordable housing for immigrants and refugees. Why is that?
Sure. I considered myself to be part of the Ugandan community and African community, and I started learning about our issues. Also, remember the house that I rented was at around the areas of Jen and Finch, which is one of the most racialized places in Toronto, and which is having a more vulnerable and the less represented groups. So I was seeing groups organizing, like groups like Jen and Finch Action Against Poverty, organizing around the work, decent housing, affordable housing, and the community spaces. So I started getting active that time. Of course, being homeless in Toronto is just dehumanizing. You are treated as a problem instead of a human being with rights. So in around 2 months, when Doug Ford started the stay-at-home order during lockdowns, I had no home and my home was church. So when they spoke about homeless people, I was one of them. And when I saw chance to a camera, I had to raise my voice. That is when I began, not as a charity, but as a survival organizing, like to do survival organizing, I began helping other refugees and asylum seekers navigate shelter systems, applying for income supports and finding community-based housing. But myself, I was still in the queue, in the wait list. At that time in January of 2020 is when I applied for rent geared to income housing. I had not known about any supports apart from OW, but there is supports like the interim housing assistance program. That program, for it to qualify for it, you must have stayed in shelter for 6 months. Cohab was not there at that time, but we had to find ways out. How do we find ways out to see that we find or we face or we counterattack the devastations around immigration, housing, and work?
Yes.
For me, apart from depending on government assistance like OW, I had to find work this time because it was all insufficient. Cleaning, taking jobs for cleaning, disinfecting the subways, helping the disabled, and working as a PSW is something which I had to embark on to find a room that I can rent and afford. But even we were treated as essential on the front lines of COVID-19, but yet disposables. Why? because many temporary workers like myself were undocumented, but we had to create a living during COVID-19. Unfortunately, these temporary agencies used it as a chance to violate our rights as workers, at the same time to deny or to be deprived our rights to housing. This kind of situation forced me or propelled me to become a voice, to become a contributing voice through interviews in media features.
How was that for you? How does it start? Do you start by seeking out media houses to talk to, or do you start by bringing groups of people together? How do you build a revolution like you're leading now?
Thank you very much. I want to say that I, first of all, had not to be silenced by my being in exile. What changed about me was the physical place, but a community concerned person or concerned, oh my God, I should say a concerned citizen in me was not taken away from me despite being an asylum seeker or being exiled in Canada. Because back home, I was organizing around conversations of veterans and youth involvement, and that is how I got into the People Power movement that time, which later gave a platform for the formation of a National Unity Platform, a political party led by Bobby Wine. So I had learned about organizing through the party. And when I came here as a member of NOP, of NUP, we were so much involved in the meetings aimed at the refugee diaspora diplomacy. For us to find hope back home was not enough. Either even finding safety here, it also was not enough. So it was a fight between here and back home. Now, here, concerns like immigration, housing and work, and mental health became a key pillar for me as a newcomer. And indeed, it's those 4 basic pillars of a newcomer to settle in Canada. So recognizing that, I had to find a way, because when I came in Canada and locating the Ugandan community, of course, I did not come through a UNHCR. I came here with a visitor visa just to flee home and see my way here and start the refugee claim and submit it for protection. Now, finding community in Ugandan community and trying to examine how I stand in the entire Canada or the Canadian diaspora, I saw that we are a community which is so much isolated. Isolated in the way of being on an island. Things happen in Ottawa, things happen at Queen's Park, things happen at the City Hall. Those things are not things we are aware about, because we have no representation. We have no area councillor that is Ugandan. We have no member of provincial parliament that is Ugandan. We have no federal MP that is Ugandan. So I was like, what is this? What is taking place? We are only organized around church. Yet there is the power of policy over prayers, in my opinion. So, it is these policies that makes us settle or kicked out. Even in the mainstream media, I could hardly see stories of Ugandans in the mainstream media. The crackdown of 2021 election, the disappearance of internet, the murder and the massacre of protesters that happened in November of 2020, all that was not seen in the mainstream media here. So I chose to be a voice through mainstream media, and a few selected stories that I can mention that he now launched me into stories that he launched me here as a media-centered advocate. Number one is the story in the Toronto Star, which is entitled "He Disinfected the Subways, Helped the Disabled, and Worked as a PSW During COVID-19."
Thank you.
So,
I am so inspired by you, because as human beings, when we are faced with adversity, what we do is worry about ourselves. We say, "I for myself and God for us all." So I'm very, very inspired by you that you're not doing that, but you have decided to turn your problems, your homelessness, into activism around housing. So the question I would like to ask you now is, between 2019, 2023, And now, what has changed and what has your role been in these changes? And I ask this question in reference to the activism that you have done, bills that you have supported, or documents that you have been able to share with the Canadian government to bring the attention to the problem that asylum seekers and refugees are facing as relates to housing and work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate. Okay, your question is about what happened. What was
has
my
changed?
role on what happened? My role was to be a voice during press conferences, to be a voice to share. Also looking for media in media. The media reporters pitching my story. I want to appreciate media reporters who have presented my story. These are not only my story; they have stories of millions of us. Among before 2023, the Toronto Star published my story. He disinfected the subways, helped in disabled adults, and worked as a PSW during COVID-19 outbreak. What a temporary worker wants you to know about life on the pandemic front lines. That story, speaking about my role, I will have to tell the world that before the refugees were seen on the streets of 129 Peter Streets and named it a crisis, African refugee housing crisis. I want to say to the world that there was a crisis before the crisis 129 Peter Street. Before that crisis was published or was given highlights in the media. Why? Because so many people were struggling, so many people were jobless, others were used as disposables on for pandemic frontline, and their voices were silent. But my story, speaking about my role, my story, when I shared it, it was distributed to all the members of parliament in Ottawa for a discussion on how to help temporary workers, on how to help refugee claimants who are saving lives. Before another follow-up story was published, this story entitled "Resigned Herself to Never Finding the Angel Who Comforted Her Dying Mother in the Middle of a COVID Outbreak, Then Fate Intervened." The other first story was published in March of 2020.
I am inclined to want to hear more about the actual changes that have occurred since way back. I mean, more than 2 years ago, since your activism has begun. What changes are you seeing that you might say are encouraging that the situation will change for many immigrants and asylum seekers?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I was talking about my two stories, one in 2021 March and another one in 2021 July. These two stories are part of the stories that helped, apart from housing, they helped to push for migration pathways to permanent residence, recognizing PSWs. Now, later, when I get energy or with the people with whom we are organizing with Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and other groups, Workers Action Center, mention those groups. When we realize this is working, we continue to put government on pressure. But after 2022, in fact, before we came in to help people get away from the streets, to take them to churches, to see their next settlements in Toronto, in Windsor, in Niagara Falls, in Cornwall, I want to say that I want to base my conversation on the report of the Ombudsman's report. The Ombudsman's report states that before the city of Toronto central intake limited asylum seekers from getting into the shelters. The city of Toronto's action to limit asylum seekers from entering shelters. The media or the community saw it in was it June or May, June, July of 2022. Oh, sorry. May, June, July of 2023. The report speaks that this had earlier happened 5 months when these refugees are being limited from entering the shelters, which the ombudsman states that it was an act of anti-Black racism. Much credit to the church leaders, the pastors, and everyone who got involved. Before we see the changes, we want to see how we transitioned to try to manage the crisis. Churches came in. RCC came on board. I appreciate the Mayor Olivia Cho for coming to see groups which I can term the invisible force helping asylum seekers settle. Many of our grassroots organizations, were not recognized before the crisis in 2023. So, what has changed? Okay, we saw the call of activists led by the mayor herself to send a voice to Ottawa. We had to learn and unlearn and relearn that refugees are a federal government. And I want to appreciate when Ottawa later, though we all understand, as mayor also mentioned to us, that government takes slow to respond to things, to crises, to issues. But later we saw funding come to help facilitate in the resettling of these our brothers and sisters. How was funding delivered to the people who were in their need? Funding came through the city, and there was the bureaucratic tendencies and classism of our organizations. I remember United was one of the key trustee to these fundings, and to apply for these fundings as organizations, it wasn't really easy to get those funding.
Do you believe that your life has changed fundamentally because of that? How has this affected you?
Me as a person,
what has changed for them?
Well, for me, continuing to voice through my struggles through stories like resilience in the city, Samuel Kisitu's journey as a refugee, as an African refugee in Toronto, and living refugee struggles, housing hardships. Samuel Kisitu's 5-year journey from Uganda to Toronto, covered by Regent Park. I have mentioned that I finally got housing in the Toronto community housing. I got 1-bedroom apartment in December of 2023. Challenges came a few months later when my family joined me, 3 children and my wife, when they joined me in May of 2024. But due to the housing bylaws, occupancy bylaws of the Toronto community housing, you cannot, or I was informed that I cannot host a family of 5 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. Now, there goes another struggle to settle my family. So, what has changed? Yes, finally later my family is settled. What has changed? That's what I can say, that what is changed about me. But
I hear you.
With other refugees, really, we want to remember what happened. In fact, there would be a moment of silence for Delphine Ngugi, a Kenyan asylum, who died at the shelter in Mississauga. But it is still in Mississauga, and Peel Family Shelter was born, was constructed. Today, if you ask me what has changed, asylum seekers which come through Pearson Airport are designated for their stay in shelters, majorly Peel Family Shelter, with the help of interim housing assistance program. There was supportive hotel program by the federal government, which has just ended. Ask me what has changed. This is October. By the end of September, that hotel program was stopped.
Right.
Now, the big thing which has hit hard the city and many other refugees we represent, I want to say, is the cutting of the funding of 107 million from the City of Toronto budget. That is like a plan to recycle what happened in 2023. Because if you don't fund the city, because the city has the central intake or managing shelters, and when any asylum seeker has to come here, they call the central intake number to find a bed. Now, if the city, in collaboration or in partnership with other organizations having or operating shelters, if they don't get the funding, it's like the feds are sending us to die, or are sending our brothers and sisters to die. As we have really seen, many people, I earlier mentioned about the numbers who were homeless, 15,000 refugees, Also, the Toronto Public reports or recorded 79 deaths among unhoused people in just the first half of 2023. So if today the Ombudsman's report gave recommendations, which recommendations were supposed to be recognized by the city, the province, and the feds, if they are not respected, if our voices are not listened to, if these deaths are not sympathized with, then it means that Toronto is not for us. Toronto is dinner for a few. It means that this anti-Black system is doubling, tripling in the numbers that we cannot imagine. The major question is, Canada still a safe haven? Is Toronto still a sanctuary city? Because in this country, in this city, everybody deserves a home. But with what's happening?
That's right. That's right. Everybody deserves a home. Now, I'm sure you're aware or you have seen reports that the new Prime Minister Carney has just issued this September funding for housing running into 13 billion Canadian dollars, and he's promising to build 500,000 units in the foreseeable future. How does that make you feel? Do you feel like that is bringing some optimism or some hope into this very, very delicate situation?
Yes, Mark Carney just launched 10 billion funds for housing. Now, the question of the day, it wouldn't have been the funding, it wouldn't have been who gets it, because we know who needs it. Get the point?
That's a
But
question. Yes. Yes, you're right.
it's unfortunate that we are living in a country which is designed to work on disappropriation of resources. Inequities that's happening, whereby the rich are so rich and the inequality, income gaps, the rich are so rich, the poor are so poor. That funding is like a nightmare to me. I think that if things are not revised, the people who really need the house will die before that funding is effected to make housing. Why? There is an information gap. There is a disappropriation reality. There is a lot of bureaucratic tendencies. The qualifications, the systematic racism cannot make the funding to reach the people who really need it. And so the challenge is that in between now and when that kind of funding is effected, people are going to die. For example, why am I saying this? When the feds released the money to help asylum seekers, we saw the big bosses, the giants of the world, or the giants of the city, to mention United Way, received the money, and it became very hard for the grassroots groups who are helping to settle these refugees to get the money to operate it. Some had to close, others are still struggling. I mean, there's trauma, there's now lack of trust because the money comes and you don't see where it goes. Or if those structures are made, the qualification to get into those structures, those housing, is hard. So may I have to say that for this funding to be effected, let us be real and human. We prioritize the spirit of Ubuntu, the reality, the belief that I am because you are, and also the narrative that nothing about us without us becomes real in this situation, that if this money is to house people who are homeless, why is it that the Kenyan community, the Ugandan community, groups where we have much numbers of the people in the shelters, much numbers of the people waiting for Canada Ontario housing benefit, much numbers of people who are devastated with the inadequate money for OW or ODSP. Why is it that the government doesn't structure ways to empower grassroots organization, like faith-led organization or cultural oriented organizations that really would serve to house our populations? Because these are our people. We understand our needs. We know, but this will end
I
up
hear
with the
you.
brokers and the housing developers instead of working on social housing to house the homeless.
I hear you. Now, the situation sounds very grim from the narrative that you have just given us. But knowing what you now know and identifying this bureaucracy, this kind of a sense of discrimination and a sense of probably misallocation of funding, how can you or what advice would you give individuals that are in need and groups that are organizing to ensure that people experiencing homelessness are catered for? How best can they prepare or how best can they engage with maybe the federal government and other entities to make sure that help gets to those that deserve it most?
Okay. I would like to. I have like 5 concrete recommendations to policymakers today to accelerate deeply affordable housing production, to make a fast track 50,000 deeply affordable units within the shortest time possible, prioritizing cities like Toronto, to bring back a permanent, stable interim housing assistance program, and also fund the Canada Ontario housing benefits, because so many people are in the shelters waiting for cohab. The wait list is so much, so there's need for more efforts in that. Create an emergency portable housing benefit for refugees and asylum seekers in their first year. So income, not immigration status determines access to housing. Reserve at least 20% of new social and supportive housing units for refugees and asylum seekers. The city and the province can do this through inclusionary zoning and targeted funding. I also recommend increase transparency and accountability. Government must publish monthly dashboards showing immigration flows, shelter use, rent levels, and affordable housing progress. Accountability can't happen without data. So, more so, with what is happening, I continue to add my voice to what I said at City Hall. Government should not cut the 107 million in funding for housing and shelter, should actually increase the funding and to see that, and also follow up to see that that funding goes to the people in the need of it, to see that the grassroots levels, the grassroots organizations, settlement organizations can get that money to help our people. Okay, I wanted to mention that we know what's holding us our progress: insufficient supply versus rapid population. When Canadians are concerned about the population, the numbers, last time we had to confront hate, spearheaded or spread by anti-immigrant groups who say we have to go, we are a problem to this country, we have to go back home. Now, it's important to understand the push and the welcoming factors. If the push factors are not worked upon, genocides, wars, dictatorships, colonialism, and the so-called, I have to mention that the scramble for resources in Congo and Uganda, I mentioned that country. I want to say that the complicity in this, complicity, for example, of Canada, in this chaos, in these crises in our homes, cannot be backed by the closure of borders. Rather than Canada should stand in its role in the freedom in the Freedoms Charter to see that
Right.
Canada stands on its kind of brand to be a place of where one finds freedom and protection. But when we see insufficient supply backed by rapid population, it means that the population are the people running of chaos. We cannot leave our people to die. Everybody has a right to find refuge, as it's written, by the United Nations, Human Rights Commission. So I feel that we should understand those realities, to understand the policy churn, and the political short-term visa changes, shifting immigration targets, finger pointing between government make long-term planning impossible. Another thing that is really holding us back before I come to the call to action is the fragmented funding and weak accountability. The House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resource found that the NHS lacked integrated delivery mechanism and measurable progress tracking. Those things, coupled with the underfunded local capacity, cities like Toronto are left to pick up federal responsibilities. This is what churches had to do. This is what we had to do, without stable funding. That's how we end up with the 2022-2023 refugee shelter crisis, where most of the people who were victims were the Africans. The Pearson has a long line every day, has long lines every day of people who get in. See, don't we ask why we didn't so much more of the colors dominating the people who were on the streets? Most of them were Africans. We have to for countering misconception, I want to address something I hear often. Immigration causes the housing crisis. That's simply not true. The CMHC and OECD both found that Canada's housing crisis is driven by decades of underbuilding, speculative investment, and rising construction costs, not newcomers. Immigration amplifies demand, yes, but it doesn't create scarcity, because we know what we contribute to Canada. When so many people could not go on the pandemic front line, we saw these asylum seekers on the pandemic front line trying to save the Canadians who decide our fate. If we care about other lives in what we do during the third class, the lower class jobs to get the Canadian economy running, why our lives not cared for? The real crisis is political.
Thank you very much for that
I conclude with this.
very insightful narrative.
Yes.
I hear you, and I want to underscore what you just said, that immigration is not the problem. Housing, undersupply, maybe there's a demand that outstrips supply is the problem. So your call to action and your last word, what would it be?
Thank you very much. Because the real crisis is political. Failure to align population policy with housing supply, income supports, and urban planning. This is my call to action. To policymakers, stop playing politics with human lives. Restore the 107 million to the city of Toronto for refugee housing. Fund the interim housing assistance program permanently and add more funding to Canada-Ontario housing benefit. Accelerate affordable housing construction to the people, and also, to the people listening who are struggling right now. You are not alone. Reach out to churches, groups, tenant unions, cooperatives, corps, settlement agencies. We are building a movement for housing justice, but we cannot do it without the support from government. And my call here to action to the government is to fund grassroots organizations, because if refugees are federal responsibilities, it means the churches, the settlement agencies are really taking up the responsibility without funding. And that is unfortunate. As I said in my deputation at City Hall in September 2025, housing is not a charity. It is a justice. I fled Uganda because my government betrayed its people. I came here believing in Canada's promise of freedom and human rights. But freedom cannot exist without housing. Dignity cannot exist without safety. So my message today is simple. Let us be human enough to understand that in this country, in this city, if the family of The Prime Minister, Mark Carney, deserves a home. The family of a refugee also deserves a home. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for making the time to speak to us and those very, very emphatic and very clear goals and demands for decent, adequate, and affordable housing for all. Thank you very much for making the time. So, with that, dear listener, we have come to the end of our podcast today. If you like our content, please tune in to our podcast on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever it is that you get your podcast. Goodbye for now. I am your host, Wanja Gadu. Till we meet again. Goodbye.
Sure. Thank you very much, Samuel Kisitu.
Thank you.
Thank you.